I can still recall our last summer. I still see it all. Walks along the Seine, laughing in the rain. Our last summer, memories that remain.
The Summer of 77, Part 1. My favourite cousin. So nice to hear from you, finally. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about me. When are you coming round for a visit? I heard that you passed your apparition test, so you've really got no excuse now. Ted and I are doing just fine, please don't worry about us. Moody sent a few friends over from the Aura's office to make sure the wards on our house were up to scratch, and they declared us perfectly safe. The only danger around here is Dora. She's a proper menace now she's started showing signs of magic. I swear, all she does is terrorise the poor old cat. The other day I caught her trying to turn his fur purple by pouring her grape juice all over him. Somehow she was actually making it work. He's still got a purple patch near his tail now, because I can't figure out how to change it back. All the parenting books told me how little we understand about juvenile magic. But alas, I did not heed their warnings. Anyway, do stop by for a visit this summer, if you have the time. I want to hear all about your camping trip, and I know Dora would love to see you. Much love, Andromeda. P.S. I don't know any more about the situation than you do, I'm afraid. Moody recommended that I stop writing to Narcissa, as the letters could be used to trace our location, and we already had to move once after everything that happened over Christmas. Not that it makes much of a difference, it wasn't like she ever responded anyway. It seems that our dear parents are all closing ranks these days. I'll let you know if I find anything out, and you let me know if you find anything out. Deal? Sirius stared down at the letter, heart sinking in his chest. It was the response he'd expected, but still, he'd hoped his cousin might know something more than he did about what was going on with their family. Yet it seemed that all either of them could do was read the newspaper, like everyone else, and hold their breath as they searched for familiar names. Sirius wasn't sure what would be worse, knowing for certain that it was his relatives committing the atrocities they heard about, or wondering about it for the rest of his life. "How's Andromeda doing?" James asked from across the breakfast table. Sirius hurriedly shoved the letter into his pocket. "Oh, yeah, good. Wants me to come visit this summer, if I can." He smiled tightly, trying to shake off the anxiety that had wormed its way into his chest. Things were worse all around with the war. While there had been no attacks of the same scale as the ones over Christmas, the violence continued, sporadic and secretive, carried out almost always under the cover of night, with nothing but the dark mark left behind. Security measures had been increased on the Potter's house, as well as most of the homes of those members of the Order. Ministry continued to twiddle its thumbs, tangled in internal debates over policies and procedures. The Ministry of Magic refused to recognize the Death Eaters as anything more than scattered terrorists, as if acknowledging that Voldemort was quickly building an organized militia would somehow lend his project credibility. "We can't make any sort of unified effort to fight the threat if we can't even agree on what the threat is," Fremont sighed one night after dinner, exhausted from a meeting at work that had run over. James's mum made a small noise in the back of her throat, glancing pointedly at the boys, and Mr. Potter took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Sorry, boys. Don't mind me. I'm just tired, that's all." Despite the very obvious toll that it was taking on them, James's parents seemed insistent, once again, that the boys have as normal a summer as possible. They did their best to comply, if only because none of them wanted to make things more difficult for Mr. and Mrs. Potter, although Sirius could tell that it was taking a toll on James, too, watching his parents grow more and more haggard, while being told that there was nothing he could do to help. All in all, it was probably best that they were getting out of the house for a little while. They began preparations for their camping trip the same day they arrived home, seeing as they only had a week to prepare. It was lucky that Remus had got permission to stay with them. It became quite obvious their first day back, when they all tramped down to the Muggle camping shop, that they would need Mooney's expertise. He was the only one who seemed to have any idea what he was doing, and spent a good 15 minutes chatting with the shopkeeper to figure out what supplies they would need to buy, as Sirius, James, and Peter tried not to look too gobsmacked while they walked up and down the aisles. They would need to properly blend in with the Muggles if they were camping, after all. Aside from taking charge of the supply purchases, Remus also took it upon himself to double-check their bags and ensure they were bringing only appropriate Muggle clothes. "No, Sirius, you cannot wear your leather pants to go camping. Where did you even find these?" And Euphemia made sure they all got cooking lessons from Gully the house elf. The plan was for them all to apparate to Cornwall, except Peter, who'd failed his test. Even though Mrs. Potter offered to take him via side-along, he decided to take the night bus instead, insisting that it made more sense because he could collect Dorcas along the way, even though she hadn't failed her apparition test. But James gave Sirius a very stern look when he went to point that out, effectively shutting him up. The evening before they left, Sirius and James squeezed into the red phone box at the end of the street, with Remus to coordinate the female quadrant of their trip. "Can I press the buttons, Moony?" James pleaded, running his fingers over the little silvery squares. "Which bit you talking to?" Sirius squinted at the oddly shaped receiver, both ends looking the same to him. "Oh, for goodness sake, you two, calm down." Remus snatched the phone out of his hands, elbowing James out of the way to dial the number. The boys watched, rapt, as he held the receiver to his ear. After a moment, they heard the tiny buzz of a voice coming through the line, but they could only make out Remus's end of the conversation. "Lilly?" There was a pause, as whoever it was speaking said something. Remus Lupin." Another pause, during which Remus shifted from foot to foot, frowning as he watched the boys' eager faces. "Oh, hi, Lilly. It's Remus." He smiled, turning away slightly and pressing the phone closer to his ear. "Yep, I think so. Pete's already left, I think. You lot?" Another pause. Sirius wished he could make out what Lilly was saying. He leaned a little closer, straining to hear, and Remus shuffled away. "Yeah, 1 o'clock, just outside the campsite. I made James get a map." "Oh, cool." Now James was getting impatient too. He tugged on Remus's sleeve, and the taller boy sighed. Lilly, James and Sirius have never used a telephone before. Can you talk to them for a minute so they leave me alone?" He waited for her to reply, then leaned back against the glass wall, smiling and holding the phone out lazily. Sirius leapt forwards, and James tried to elbow him out of the way, which led to a subdued scuffle, before they each ended up with one hand wrapped around the receiver, faces squashed together as they both tried to press it to their ears. "Lilly! Evans! Hello? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Oh my God, you two!" Her voice came like magic through the receiver, a little bit muffled and scratchy, but unmistakable nonetheless. "Yes, I can hear you." "That's amazing. Oi, Evans, how's the weather over there? Lilly, your voice sounds just as marvellous through the telephone as it does in person." Remus rolled his eyes, and through the receiver they heard Lily's exasperated groan, though it was followed by a laugh. "Oh, shut up, Potter, or I'll hang up on you." Saturday, the 9th of July, 1977. James Potter was in a tree. A tree. And not just any tree. An incredibly old tree, and therefore an incredibly tall tree. He stood at least 10 feet off the ground, clinging to one of its gnarled branches. "Quit laughing, will you?" he shouted down huffily. "Black! Oi, help me out here, would you?" Sirius was gasping for breath, clutching at his sides as he cackled. You! He shook his head, bursting into another fit of laughter as he caught sight of James's helpless expression. "Sirius? What are you laughing at?" "McKinnon!" Marlene yelped, startled, and swung around to look up. "Potter? What in God's name are you doing up there?" He's... Sirius pointed, wiping tears from his eyes with his other hand. "He's in a tree!" This sent him into another fit of laughter, and Marlene chuckled, shaking her head. "Well, obviously, I can see that. Oi! Hello? Can you two please stop laughing at me and help?" It took a bit of manoeuvring and full-body levitation spell, but they eventually were able to free Potter from his linguous position. The three of them picked their way slowly throughout the woods, bless Remus for making James buy a map, and down to the little campsite office, where they found Mary and Lilly waiting near a couple of picnic benches. There was a bit of discussion as to whether they should wait for Remus before checking in, which ended when Lilly shook her head at James and Sirius huffing. "He's got more sense than the two of you combined. I'm sure he'll find his way just fine." With that, she marched into the office, leaving the rest of them to wait outside on the benches. As it turned out, Evans was right. Only a few minutes later, the group caught sight of a familiar wiry frame picking its way towards them. Mary and Marlene both jumped up, grinning. "We thought we'd lost you." "Overshot," Remus shrugged. "Landed on the beach. Not in the water, luckily." "Well, we all ballsed it up a bit," Mary said, chuckling, and Sirius chimed in. "Yeah, you'll never believe where Prongs ended up." As soon as Lilly had finished checking them in, the entire group made their way through the campsite, searching for the best spot to pitch their tents. James and Sirius steered them as close to the beach as possible, where they would have easy access to the water. With the spot secured, it was time to actually set up the tents, which was far more complicated than Sirius anticipated. Fortunately, Lilly took charge of the instructions, squinting at the manual and yelling at everyone in her stern, exasperated prefect's voice. "No, not that hook. I said the other corner. Oh, bloody hell, Black. Use the flipping mallet, not your boot. Oh, come on, chop chop, we haven't got all day." "Blimey, Evans," James gave her a dopey smile, holding up one of the poles as Mary and Marlene struggled to drape the canvas over it. "Have you ever considered Quidditch coaching? You'd be incredible." "Please, no," Marlene groaned, head obscured beneath the thick canvas. "I'll leave the team if I have to put up with both of you blowing whistles at me." In the end, it took them nearly 2 hours to erect the tents, but they were having such a blast that they hardly felt like a chore. Sirius grinned down at the fruits of their labour, a neat row of tents, all lined up and pointed towards the sea. "Well done, lads," Lilly said, smiling impishly as she put the kettle on to boil. "And no magic at all. You'll make muggles yet." It wasn't much longer before Peter and Dorcas arrived, both looking a bit haggard and dishevelled after their long trip aboard the night bus. "It stopped in Guernsey twice before we even started south," Dorcas muttered, frowning. Peter gratefully took the cup of tea that Lilly offered, yawning as he plopped down on the grass. After their tea break, Lilly roused everyone to go down to the beach. The girls giggled and disappeared into their tents to change, while James and Sirius only had to strip off their shirts and jeans. They had already put their muggle swim trunks on underneath their clothes before they left. Remus was the only one who didn't change, wearing jeans and a long-sleeved shirt, as the rest of them tramped down to the beach in their swimsuits. Sirius thought he understood why. He'd been nervous about his own scars, which were usually covered by his trousers. The girls had never seen them before, and even James hardly ever caught a glimpse, except for when they were getting dressed in the mornings. He had considered keeping his jeans on like Remus, but it was the sea. He couldn't just not go swimming. Sirius told himself firmly that his mother had ruined enough for him. He wasn't going to let her ruin this, too. Besides, once he was in the water, no one would even see his legs. Sirius strode up to his waist immediately, diving as soon as he was deep enough. The water closed around his head, cool and smooth as silk, sending tendrils of hair floating up around his face. He luxuriated in the feel of it, swimming out further than the others, where he could dive and twist under the gentle waves. He floated on his back for a bit, water climbing over his ears and muffling the sounds of the outside world, so that all he could hear was the muted rush of his own pumping blood. Above him, the sky was clear and blue, like something out of a postcard. By the time they returned to their tents, everyone was starving. Luckily, Marlene and Dorcas volunteered to oversee dinner, using some little muggle stove contraption that Lily's father had lent to fry her bacon. Lilly decided they needed milk, and James volunteered immediately to accompany her to the shop. They returned 15 minutes later with a case of cider. "Muggle drinks too?" Sirius clapped his hands together, excited. "We're getting the full rounded experience, apparently," James said, nudging Lilly. She giggled and looked away, cheeks almost as red as her hair. Mary had the foresight to light a fire before Lilly could come back and force them to do it the Muggle way, and Marlene had brought along a wireless radio. With the cans of cider passed all around, the evening had just become perfect. "How long have you two been going out?" Dorcas asked, smiling at James and Lilly. The pair glanced at each other, eyes wide, then quickly looked away. "We're not," Lilly said hurriedly, jumping up to move over by Remus. Sirius shot James a confused look, but he just shrugged and sipped his cider, stifling a smile. "Oh, sorry," Dorcas giggled. "I just thought... But Sirius and Mary, you used to go out, right?" For a moment Sirius tensed, but then Mary threw back her head, laughing. "For my sins!" Sirius smirked at her, poking out his tongue. Marlene, who had a guidebook from the Visitors' Information Centre open on her lap, cleared her throat. "There's a castle ruin not far from here. We could go tomorrow." And just like that, the subject had been changed, as everyone began to discuss what they would do for the remainder of the week. Sirius sipped his cider, feeling relieved. He supposed he should have expected some talk of relationships, what with Peter and Dorcas, and James continuing his long-standing tradition of pining over Lilly. But he'd hoped that he'd been able to avoid it, for the most part. After his break-up with Emmeline, Sirius simply didn't have the energy to think about girls. Getting her curse lifted had taken ages. And then, of course, there was Remus. Their conversation in the hospital wing had drawn a very clear line, a line which Sirius knew he was not to cross. Their thing, whatever it was, had been making Remus miserable. It had to stop. Sirius couldn't spend all his time agonizing about it, holding petty grudges when Mooney hadn't even done anything wrong, not if he wanted to salvage what he could of their bruised friendship. So he had buried it. Or at least, he'd tried to. When Remus came to stay with them at the Potter's house, Sirius had done his absolute best to act as though everything were normal. He'd teased and joked and played impromptu games of Quidditch. Apparently James had been giving Remus flying lessons, and he was now actually able to move back and forth across the field, instead of hovering uselessly in mid-air. He'd played Bowie records in the living room, and planned out which films to see at the Muggle cinema. He'd eaten meals across the table from Mooney, making eye contact and smiling and listening when he talked. It was easier with James there, like a buffer between them. If Sirius found himself wanting to stare at the way Remus chewed his lip while he was curled up reading in an armchair, or if watching Mooney blink sleep out of his eyes as they ate breakfast in the morning made his chest ache, or if seeing Remus's elated smile, the first time he'd actually managed to score a goal on Peter, set his heart racing, well, Sirius would retreat into his familiar banter with James, waiting until he felt a little less hollow to speak to Remus again. This method worked well enough. It was working now, sitting around the fire with their friends. Even after the cider had made him feel sort of warm and fuzzy, Sirius was very pointedly not staring at the way the flames lit Mooney's face from below, glancing across his skin, illuminating his scars, the way that was new and sort of mesmerizing. Instead, he was competing with James to see who could create the biggest shower of sparks by throwing stones onto the fire. He had just selected a new pebble to throw when the song on the radio changed. "Turn it up," Mary urged, bumping Marlene's shoulder with hers. The other girl smiled and flicked her wand as she reached for another can of cider. It seemed that everyone was feeling a bit silly and drowsy from the drink. They quieted down to listen, heads bobbing, feet tapping. The song had been a favourite at many Gryffindor parties, and when they got to the chorus, all the girls sang along under their breath. By the time the song ended, they were all smiling, laughing, and raising their cans of cider as they cheered. "I bloody love you lot," Marlene slurred. "You're all my best friends." "Same to you, McKinnon." Sirius saluted her with his cider, grinning from across the little circle. "Shh!" She waggled a finger at him drunkenly. "I know your game black. I'll have you know you're not my type." That had everyone in stitches, including Sirius. "When are we going to find you a nice girl, Remus?" Lilly murmured, cuddling into the side of the taller boy. Remus smiled tenderly, wrapping an arm around her, and the laughter died in Sirius's throat. "Yeah, you deserve a bit of fun, Mooney," James teased, winking. Sirius was pretty sure that he was frowning now, but he couldn't be blamed for that. The cider had made it difficult to control his expression. "I have plenty of fun with you lot," Remus said, taking a swig from his own drink. "Have you ever had a girlfriend, Remus?" Dorcas asked curiously. Sirius had to stifle a burst of irritation. He knew it wasn't her fault that she was outside of the Marauder's loop, but it was still bloody annoying. Remus exchanged a sly look with Mary. "Nah." "Aw," Dorcas murmured, slurring a bit. "How come?" For a moment, Sirius thought he might not answer. Mooney was looking around the circle, brow furrowed slightly, as though he were considering something. Then he turned back to the fire, staring directly into the flames as he took a breath. "I'm gay."
We made our way along the river and we sat down in the grass by the Eiffel Tower. I was so happy we had met. It was the age of no regret. Oh, yes.
Part 2. Somewhere I have never travelled, gladly beyond. Any experience, your eyes have their silence. In your most fragile gesture are things which enclose me, or which I cannot touch because they are too near. Your slightest look easily will unclose me, though I have closed myself as fingers. You open, always, petal by petal, myself as spring opens, touching skilfully, mysteriously, her first rose. From E. E. Cummings. It was like being punched in the face. Sirius nearly dropped his can of cider, reeling, mind gone utterly blank, as he stared across the fire. Remus had said it like it was simple, like it was easy, like it was nothing to be ashamed of. "I'm gay." But that wasn't possible. That wasn't possible, because Mooney had said he wasn't queer. They'd both said that they weren't queer, and if he was, then that changed everything. Sirius was vaguely aware of Peter choking on his drink, of James straightening up beside him, of the shocked expressions on Mary and Marlene's faces. Oh, Merlin, no one was talking, everyone was just staring, the way he was staring. Should he say something? Was he meant to say something? Panic cracked up Sirius's throat, making it difficult to breathe. But then Lilly turned, lifting her head off Remus's shoulder, and giving him a quick peck on the cheek. She snuggled back into his arm, leaning against him, and said very firmly, "You still deserve some fun." And just like that, everyone was suddenly moving on, conversation resuming when Marlene asked some stupid question about Quidditch. Lilly remained cuddled next to Remus, and Peter went back to trying to sneak his hands up Dorcas's shirt, and Mary laughed loudly at something James had said. But Sirius remained quiet, thoughts tangled in his head. He had to bite his tongue to force back the question that spilled into his mouth, crowding behind his teeth. "Since when? For how long? How long have you known? Before or after we? And you don't care? You're okay with it. You don't think it's... But why wouldn't you tell me? Why wouldn't you say something? Why would you let me believe?" He thought back on the past year, scrambling to understand. Everything was suddenly different, reframed. The experiment with Mary, the weird comments about girls, every touch, every kiss, every conversation veiled in half-truths. Sirius tried, desperately, to pass through it, to piece it all together. The cider wasn't helping. It clouded his head and made his brain feel foggy, sluggish. But he couldn't stop drinking it, clinging pathetically to its hazy warmth. After 2 hours, Sirius felt thoroughly drunk, and no closer to understanding what, exactly, he was meant to make of Remus's declaration. He wasn't the only one feeling the effects of the cider. Everyone seemed a bit dopey, although Peter and Dorcas were certainly the worst. They were snogging furiously, falling back onto the grass. "Go back to your tent if you're going to do that." James chucked an empty cider can at Peter's head. "Do you mind, Mooney?" Peter asked, slurring as he pulled away from Dorcas. "If we go back to ours, you can bunk with Prongs and Padfoot, can't you?" No, Sirius thought, panicked, staring down at his own can of cider. He had no idea what would happen if he had to share a tent with Remus, not after what he'd just found out. "Oh, don't worry, I'll find somewhere," Remus assured Peter, gamily. Fuck! Without further ado, Peter and Dorcas darted into their tent, zipping it up and giggling. Their voices soon disappeared under the silencing charm, leaving an empty, flat sort of quiet hanging behind. You can share with us if you want, Remus, Mary offered, stretching and yawning loudly. Lily nodded. Yeah, our tent's much bigger. Come with us. Thanks, girls. He smiled at them. You go on. I'm not tired yet. I think I'll just go for a walk. He stood slowly, ambling off towards the beach, away from the fire. Pretty soon he had disappeared into the dark. Sirius finished off the last of his cider, mind still buzzing with questions. He was staring into the fire, watching it eat through the middle of a burning log, when James suddenly clapped him on the back. All right there, Padfoot. He straightened quickly. Yeah, fine. James nodded, then jerked his head towards the beach. Come on, let's go check on Mooney. Sirius's heart stuttered in his chest. What? Why? But James didn't respond, only gave him a stern, pointed look, and Sirius could do nothing but swallow and stand and follow after him. A cigarette, a bright point of orange against the dark. He stood on the edge of the beach, at the line where the trees gave way to sand, staring out at the sea. A lazy nighttime breeze played with the smoke, curling it away from his face. All right, Mooney, James said, walking up to stand beside him. Sirius shoved his hands into his pockets, shoulders tense with anxiety. All right, Remus replied. He offered a fag to James, who shook his head. He ignored Sirius. Just wanted to see if you were okay. I'm fine, thanks. Good. Sorry if I made things awkward. You didn't, James said quickly, a bit too enthusiastic, making Sirius cringe. Honestly, mate, we're glad you told us, really. Remus nodded and turned back to the sea, lifting his cigarette to his lips. James caught sight of Sirius's eye, nudging him and raising his eyebrows to indicate that he should say something too. But Sirius couldn't speak. His voice had shriveled and died in the back of his throat. James frowned, then looked back to Remus. Don't run off, okay, Mooney? Remus glanced at him, eyebrows raised, and James gave him a wry smile. Yeah, we know what you're like. Stay, okay? Everything's fine. Even Pete wasn't that bothered. Pete, Remus shook his head. He's too busy trying to get his end away. Can't blame him, James chuckled, then reached out to touch Remus's shoulder gently. Do you want to talk about it? Remus looked away, shaking his head. He stubbed out his cigarette and reached for another. Sirius wished Mooney would just offer him one. He could have used it to calm his nerves, but he didn't. Thanks, James. He exhaled smoke, and Sirius had to remind himself to breathe. You're a real mate. Still marauders, James said easily, yawning. Think I'm going to turn in. Come in? I'm going to have another one after this. Remus waved his cigarette. I'll have one too, Sirius said quickly. James stifled another yawn and he nodded, turning back to the campsite. Don't come back stinking of fag ash, you two, he called, already walking towards the trees. Remus didn't look at Sirius as he handed him the box of cigarettes, turning back to the sea. Sirius remained silent as he lit up and inhaled, sucking in smoke and letting it sit for a moment in his lungs. He exhaled slowly. There were so many things he wanted to say, so many questions he needed to ask. He didn't know where to begin, so he started with the simplest one. Why did you say that? He stared out at the water as he asked it, not sure if he could trust himself to talk if he had to look at Mooney's face. Wanted to, Remus said simply. Just had to know what they'd think, one way or another. Sirius tried to swallow the lump in his throat. It's like you've just gone and changed everything around on me. Didn't mean to. Were you expecting me to say something too? Remus tensed. No, I wasn't expecting anything. His words were sharp, clipped. It wasn't anything to do with you, actually. Okay. Sirius raised his hands, surrendering, still unable to look at the other boy in the face. I just thought you might have told me first, that's all, given the situation. Now Remus turned to look at him, brow furrowed, and before Sirius knew it, he was all tangled up in those frustrated eyes. You mean you didn't already know? How could you not know? You said you weren't, Sirius replied, defensive. Like I said I wasn't. I thought we were on the same page, that's all. Remus was angry. Sirius could see it, familiar and simmering in his eyes. but he still couldn't look away.
Obviously we weren't, he said coolly. Anyway, I don't see how it matters now. If that's all you're worried about, then don't. You're safe. Remus glared, the heat in his gaze incongruous with his icy voice. I'm not going to tell anyone about you and me, and I doubt anyone suspects you, what with your considerable history with girls. I don't see why you care so much about what I tell people.
I've had it all wrong, Sirius thought numbly. Merlin, I've been such a fool. I do care. He spoke earnestly, heart pounding, hope ruffling her fragile feathers in his chest. Remus closed his eyes, as if the words were painful, and Sirius felt a frantic pulse of adrenaline. Look at me. Remus, just look at me. I can care about you and not scream it from the rooftops.
Wanting to get off with me isn't the same as caring. His voice was flat, resigned. Sirius could have screamed.
Was that really what Remus had been thinking all this time? How could he think that? How could he not see? Remus! Fucking hell! Just because I haven't got whatever you have yet. It doesn't mean I don't have the same... Oh, fuck's sake! He didn't know how to put it into words, how to explain. Didn't know what was allowed, what was still too much.
And all the girls?
Remus asked, cigarette burning between his fingers. That's different.
Okay.
His voice was so hollow. Sirius ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. You don't understand. Remus didn't respond, looking back at the sea, like the conversation was already over. He lifted the cigarette to his lips, inhaling. Fuck that, Sirius thought, reaching out to grab his arm. This isn't over. You're not leaving again. When I think about myself with them, he said, searching for the words to explain, I can just see it, you know? I know how it's going to play out. I know what I'm supposed to do. When I think about me and you know, the real me and you, it's just, I can't see how it ends. I just tried not to think about it. So, I know I was a bit of a dick, and I could have handled it better, but I swear I didn't want it to end like that. He felt far, far too fragile, like something with the shell removed. He couldn't turn back, not now. Sirius took a breath, then said, I didn't want it to end at all, to be honest. He stared desperately at Remus's face, willing him to understand, but the other boy only nodded, pushing his hand away gently without turning to look at him.
Look, Sirius, I don't mean to be cruel, and I do understand all that.
He sighed softly.
I know it's not easy for you.
A small, relieved noise slipped from the back of Sirius's throat, but Remus was still talking.
But it is easy for me, okay? I'm queer. And I know when we started I said that I wasn't, and, well, I shouldn't have said that, because I am. And I'm not saying that you're queer too, or you have to be, or anything, but I couldn't carry on the way we were without you just, I don't know, acknowledging it.
Sirius studied his face as he spoke, mind spinning. Remus didn't look angry anymore, just sad, tired, like he was repeating a conclusion he had already come to, already accepted, a long time ago. But if he was actually saying what Sirius thought he was saying, could it really be that easy? Not just mates, Sirius thought, stomach turning in flips. Not just getting off, but more. Is that what he wants? He nodded once, quickly. Okay then.
What?
Remus asked sharply, finally turning to look at him. Fucking acknowledged. Message received. Sirius dropped his cigarette into the wet sand, stubbing it out with his toe.
So, what? Remus stared at him in shock. We just leave things as they are.
Sirius swallowed, looking down, hoping that it was dark enough to hide his blush. I'd rather not.
You'd rather not?
Remus echoed, blinking. No. I mean, if you want me to go around telling everyone I know, then sorry. But I'm not all as ballsy as you. I need more time. But I could try.
You could try,
Remus repeated again, still staring in bewilderment.
What do you mean?
But Sirius didn't wait for him to finish. reaching out to touch his cheek. He turned Mooney to face him, heart thundering in his chest as he leaned and brushed a soft kiss across his lips. "I mean, I will try," he whispered, pressing their foreheads together. "I miss you, Mooney." Please, he thought, please want this too. Please don't let me be wrong about this. But then Remus was pulling him back, fingers tangling in his hair, kissing him like it was air, like they had both been drowning. Sirius was sure his ribs would crack with the force of his own heartbeat, but he couldn't bring himself to care. The entire world could have imploded around him, and he wasn't sure he would have even noticed. He didn't want to be anywhere except here, in Remus's arms, incandescent with joy and relief. "No more girls?" Remus asked when they broke apart, gasping. "No more girls," Sirius breathed, smiling so hard that his cheeks ached. "Let's see how this pans out first." "Oh, charming." Remus let go of him, snorting. "Oh, shut up." Sirius knocked their shoulders together, shoving his hands back into his pockets. "Come on, let's get back to the tents, eh? I'm freezing." They turned back and picked their way towards the campfire, which was beginning to sputter pitifully in the wind, more embers than anything. "I think I'm drunk," Remus said, voice far away. "I make bad decisions when I'm drunk." Sirius laughed, reaching out to squeeze his shoulder. "I know. I promise this isn't one of them." Remus reached up, grabbing the hand on his shoulder and stroking his thumb over Sirius's knuckles, once. "Okay." Of course, it was just their luck that all the tents were mysteriously occupied on their return. Remus and Peter's tent was obviously in use, judging by the sounds coming from inside. Sirius made a face, waving his wand quickly to cast a fresh silencing spell. Amateurs. Even more intriguing was the silencing spell cast over James and Sirius's tent, which Mary explained when she poked her head out of her own tent, whispering delightedly, "It's James and Lilly." "Are you serious?" Sirius whispered back, floored. "Bloody hell. I mean, wow. I sort of want to go and shake his hand or something." "I have a feeling his hands are busy," Remus said wryly. "Want to come in with me, Remus?" Mary offered, wobbling a bit from where she was propped up on her arms. "What about Sirius?" "Oh, right. Oh, fine. I'll get in with Miles. Night, lads." She scooted out, crawling over to Marlene's tent. Sirius blinked, not quite sure if he could believe their luck. They turned to stare at each other for a moment, then Sirius climbed in before Mary could change her mind. "Knew we should have got the Muggle-borns to sort us out," he muttered, clambering over the plush pile of blankets and pillows strewn across the blown-up mattress, which was much more comfortable than their own tent. Remus crawled in after him, and they spent a few moments shifting around trying to get comfortable. The mattress was a bit warm and sank in the middle, forcing them to roll together and curl up like spoons. Not that Sirius was complaining. "This okay?" Remus whispered, breath tickling the back of Sirius's ear as he slipped an arm around his waist. "Of course," Sirius muttered, suppressing a shiver as heat crawled up his spine. "We could just sleep." Sirius rolled his eyes. "Sonorio Crisis." "Ah, okay." There was very little talking after that. When they had finished, Sirius curled back into Remus's arms, feeling sleepy and sated and warm. He could feel Remus's chin pressed against the back of his head, Remus's legs tangled with his. He was already half asleep when the other boy whispered, "Sirius?" "Mm-hmm." "There's something else I need to tell you." That woke him up a bit. Sirius rolled onto his back, groaning. "Oh, Merlin. What now?" Well, I'm homeless." "What?" Now he was fully awake, eyes snapping open to stare at Remus. "What?" "Since I turned 17, you know I'm of age now, so they just chucked you out?" Remus nodded, chewing his lip. "Yeah, so once Hogwarts finishes next summer, I've got nowhere to go." "Bastards!" Sirius scowled, thinking back to Mooney's birthday, how upset he'd been before the party, storming out of Dumbledore's office. "Well, you can stay with me and James at the Potters. They won't mind. I know they won't. Then when school's finished, we'll find our own place." "We will?" Remus asked. "Yeah," Sirius grinned, folding his arms behind his head. "It'll be just like school. You, me, James and Pete, all together." "Oh," Remus blinked. "Yeah, sounds great. I've a bit of money from Lyle left for me." "Pfft," Sirius snorted. "I've got enough money for all of us. Don't worry about that." "Okay," Remus said softly. "I won't worry." "Go to sleep," Sirius yawned, "or you'll be knackered tomorrow." "Okay," Remus sighed and closed his eyes.
Those crazy years, that was the time of the flower power. But underneath, we had a fear of flying, of growing old, a fear of slowly dying. We took a chance, like we were dancing our last dance.
Part 3. Sirius woke the next morning with Remus Lupin beside him, warm and solid, arms still wrapped around his waist. He opened his eyes and the other boy was already awake, smiling the sort of soft, unguarded smile that made Sirius's heart clench like a fist. "I could stay here forever," he thought. "Morning." "Morning." "Fuck me, my mouth is dry." "Yeah, mine too." Remus ran his tongue over his teeth, which did very interesting things to Sirius's heartbeat. "I could go get some water from the pump." "Yeah, we'll both go. Reckon anyone else is up?" Remus cocked his head, listening, then shook his head no. Sirius yawned, taking a moment to stretch before he began to dig through the bottom of their bed to try and find their various discarded articles of clothing. Outside, the sun shone cheerfully, forcing them to squint as they clambered out of the tent. Sirius yawned again, blinking as he waited for his eyes to adjust. It was an idyllic day. Bright blue sky, soft green grass, gentle breeze that smelled of the sea. Overhead, sparrows flitted between the branches of the trees, their chirping and the quiet rustling of the underbrush the only sounds that filtered through the peaceful silence of the morning. The two boys walked side by side in the direction of the water pump, and Sirius found that he couldn't stop smiling. They ducked into the shower block to wash their faces before filling their canteens, along with the others that they'd brought. Sirius studied the nearby shop, a little wooden hut overhung with a faded blue and white striped awning. "Shop sells pasties," he said, nodding to the chalkboard sign out front. "Shall we get some for breakfast? Return to the camp as heroes." "Good idea," Remus said, smiling. They purchased perhaps a few more pasties than was necessary, but Sirius had seen Remus eat, and there was no telling how hungry the others would be. Better safe than sorry, he figured. Their friends were still dead to the world when they returned, so the two boys left most of the pasties behind and took their own breakfast out to the beach. They sat side by side, toes digging into the sun-warmed sand, eating quietly. Sirius tried not to stare as Remus licked the grease from his fingers afterwards. "I could get used to this," he sighed happily, rubbing the crumbs from his hands on his jeans. The sand was a smooth, blank slate, washed clean overnight by the tide. "Never been on a proper holiday before." "Me neither." Remus was restless beside him, picking at the sparse grass that poked stubbornly from the sand. "Oi," Sirius nudged him. "What's up, Mooney? We said no worrying." "Sorry." "What's up?" "I was just wondering something. It's stupid, don't worry." Sirius turned back to the sea, waiting. The breeze played with his hair, sending a few strands dancing across his face. After a moment, Remus sighed. "Why me?" he murmured, almost a whisper. Why me, in the first place? Why not James, or literally anyone else? Is it because I let you? The path of least resistance?" Sirius blinked, taken aback. Silly, beautiful, infuriating boy. Did he really not get it? "Obviously not," Sirius frowned. "What do you mean, not James? I don't fancy James. Snogging James would be like snogging his brother." He suppressed a shudder at that image. Though, Sirius thought snidely about his family, they would probably be less upset about the sibling aspect of things and more upset that he was snogging a bloke. Oh, I think we can at least admit that we fancy each other," Sirius said wryly, reaching over to run his thumb over Remus's hip. The other boy nodded, swallowing. "Yeah, I just thought, I don't know." Sirius studied his face for a moment. He was still fidgeting with his hands, not quite making eye contact. We never touched much.
What?
Before all the shagging, Sirius explained. I used to wrestle with James all the time, and we used to share a bed sometimes and everything. Not you. You kept yourself separate. No touching.
I was shy.
It got me curious, I suppose. One Christmas, I remember when Andromeda came to stay at the Potters. I was really nervy, convinced that my mother was coming to get me every 5 minutes. I jumped whenever the door went.
I remember, Remus murmured. 3rd year.
Well, the door went and I was bricking it, and we were on the landing, I think. You sort of squeezed my shoulder, and, well, it felt really nice. It meant more, because it was you. I felt like you'd, I don't know, chosen me or something. Couldn't get you out of my head for weeks.
We were 14.
So?
You and Mary started going out not long after that.
Yeah, and look how that turned out. Sirius shook his head, laughing. Remus chuckled too, and they both fell quiet, smiling. Sirius took a breath. Then on your birthday, he said, thinking of that night in the stairwell, you kissed me. It still felt so fresh, the heat, the panic, the shame.
I did, Remus said quietly. Sorry.
I didn't expect it. It was so out of the blue. I'd been thinking about you before that, but I didn't really know. I didn't know what I was thinking about was that. And then I thought maybe it was my fault, like I'd given off some sort of message, like I'd tricked you into it or something.
What? No. Trust me, I very much wanted to kiss you.
Oh, good. Because I just felt so awful about it, you know. It was your first kiss, and I went and mucked it all up.
Remus shook his head, sheepish. Look, while we're being honest, you might as well know it wasn't my first kiss.
What?
Yeah, the summer before, I sort of met someone. I never told any of you. I didn't want you to know I was queer.
And just like that, the pieces fell into place.
That boy, Sirius said, frowning.
At the Muggle squat, in the Mile End. He tried to remember. It was strange, sifting through Padfoot's memories as a human. Everything was different, fuzzier. He couldn't quite recall what the boy had looked like, but he remembered his smell, remembered how it had been all over Remus.
His name's Grant, Remus said.
Well, I hate him. Remus shook his head, laughing.
That's okay. He's so nice you won't even mind.
Well, I hate him even more.
I ought to try and see him this summer. He's been so good to me. You don't even know the half of it.
I'll go with you, if you want, Sirius offered, stifling the ugly twist of jealousy at the way Remus smiled when he talked about him.
Grant. Thanks. That's kind.
Sirius swallowed, looking away. Moony?
Hmm?
I'm really sorry about everything.
It's okay.
It's not.
It is. It's not. Sirius! For God's sake. You can't even apologise without starting a fight. I'm telling you, it's okay. I was being unfair. I think I was asking you for something I didn't understand properly myself. Loyalty or love or whatever.
I do love you, Moony.
Too much.
I love all of you. You, James, Peter.
Yeah.
Remus sighed and shut his eyes. Sirius let him breathe for a moment. When he opened his eyes and turned back, it was with a reassuring smile.
Looking forward to 7th year.
Sirius shrugged. Dunno. Bit scary, isn't it?
You mean the war?
The war, he nodded. Other stuff, too. Last year before we have to grow up.
Remus huffed a laugh. I don't think you'll ever grow up, Padfoot.
It was meant to be joking, but the words burrowed into him, all the same. I've been too selfish, Sirius said, thinking back on everything he'd said, everything he'd done over the past year. Past 2 years. His whole life, really.
I said it's fine.
It's not, though, he frowned, frustrated, trying to find the words to explain. You have so many secrets, and it must be so shit keeping things back. The words were coming faster now, spilling off his tongue, and I made it all worse. I gave you more things to hide. I'm still doing it, he thought miserably. You told them the truth, and I'm giving you another reason to hide it. He tried to swallow the lump in his throat, reaching out to grasp Remus's hand. It's not that I'm ashamed of you, or this. He stared into Remus's eyes, hoping the other boy could feel the truth of it. It was all so difficult to explain. The shame was still there, a crawling thing. When he thought about himself, his family, other people, but not Remus. When Remus touched him, it was like it faded. For the moment, at least. Like shadows chased away by the sunshine, even if they always crept back. It's a million other things. I wish I could tell everyone. I wish I was ready. I will be, Mooney, I promise. Remus smiled at him softly. Absolution. One day, Sirius thought. One day I'll be as brave as you.
James seemed pretty okay with me being queer, Remus said after a moment. Sirius snorted, looking away. Well, of course he was. The beautiful bastard. He shook his head. Fucking prince among men, isn't he? I know, he's probably fine with this, even. He squeezed Remus's hand. But he's my best friend. And I don't want that to change, yet. I don't want to be alone with him and have him wondering. Even if he wasn't thinking about it, I would be. Okay, Remus nodded, and Sirius felt an overwhelming swell of gratitude. Morning, lads, Mary shouted from the campsite. Sirius yanked his hand away quickly, then gave Remus an apologetic smile. Cheers for the pasties! They both turned around, waving. Sirius stood and reached down to help Remus to his feet. Come on, he grinned. Can't wait to rip the shit out of Prongs for finally getting his leg over. Not in front of Lilly, Remus warned. She'll curse your knob off. Well, we can't have that. I'm very much attached to my knob. Sirius? Remus? This isn't just for the summer, is it? Sirius paused, turning to smile up at him. I bloody hope not. Back at the campsite, everyone had finally crawled out of their tents and was sitting around the remains of the fire from the previous night. Peter was focused on a pasty, Mary was grinning wickedly at Lilly, and Marlene was ashen-faced, with a blanket around her shoulders. All right, Miles? Remus asked kindly, sitting down next to her. Mm-hmm. Poor love, Mary said sympathetically, giving Marlene a little pat on the head. Went a bit hard on the old Rosie, didn't you? Still, could be worse. Dorcas hasn't come back from the loos yet. James and Lilly were seated side by side, with a careful 6 inches of distance between them. James looked as if he was trying to stifle a grin. Lilly as if she was trying to stifle a groan. Sirius shot his friend a wink as he sat down, wiggling his eyebrows. So, Mary raised a brow, glancing around the circle. We'll stick with the new sleeping arrangements for the rest of the week then, shall we? Suits me, Sirius said, grinning. And me, Peter agreed, around a bite of pasty. Marlene gave a shaky thumbs up, pressing her other hand on her mouth. Both Lilly and James glanced at each other, then pointedly looked away. Once the pasties had been thoroughly demolished, the girls decided that the trip to the showers was in order. They walked ahead in a huddled group, murmuring and giggling. The boys followed a few feet behind, and Sirius took the opportunity to begin teasing James, immediately. No, go away, I'm not telling you anything, the other boy shoved him, laughing. This is purely for academic purposes, Sirius gasped, affronted. It's going to be a matter of historical interest. Future generations will need to know what miraculous feats you had to perform in order to convince Lily Evans to, we just talked. Oh, so the silencing spell was for... James blushed furiously, darting into a shower cubicle to hide. Sirius chuckled, shaking his head. He'd get it out of him, eventually. Doesn't anyone want to know about me and Dorcas? Peter asked. Sirius was the last one out of the showers, at least, among the boys. He exited a cubicle, whistling cheerfully, to find that Remus and Peter had already returned to the campsite. James was still waiting for him, though, leaning against the wall with his wet towel slung over his shoulder. Merlin, you certainly took your time. Sirius laughed. You didn't have to wait for me. Unless
You come to your senses and decided to tell me the juicy details about what went on with Evans. Hang on, let me find a pen, I'll have to take notes. James rolled his eyes. I already told you. We just talked. Sure, Sirius smirked at him as they fell into step, heading back towards the campsite. And I'm madly in love with Severus Snape. Come on, James. You know you're going to tell me eventually. The other boy just chuckled and shook his head, smiling enigmatically. After a moment, he grew serious, saying, Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something else. Oh. Yeah. Remus. Sirius's mouth went dry. Fuck, were they that obvious? Had James somehow figured it out? He struggled to keep his voice casual as he asked, What about Remus? James shifted, looking uncomfortable. Just, look, mate, I know what your family thinks about that stuff, okay? And I get it if you feel a certain way or whatever. But, now he grew stern, using his Quidditch captain voice, if you say anything to him, or do anything to make him feel like he's done something wrong, then I just want you to know that I will truly, seriously, beat the piss out of you. Sirius blinked. What? I mean it, James said, frowning. I saw how you were acting last night. You were being properly weird about it. And I don't care what kind of rubbish you think you've heard from your family. There's nothing wrong with him, being who he is. It took a lot of guts for him to tell us. So if I so much as catch you looking at him funny, we'll be taking things outside to the Quidditch pitch. Understand? Sirius struggled desperately not to laugh. What if I look at him funny while we're here? He asked innocently. Will you have to thump me on the beach? I'm being serious. So am I. Oh, shut it, Black. James gave him a shove, smiling reluctantly. Sirius grinned. I mean it, Prongs, he said. You don't have to worry about me. I feel the same way that you do about it, trust me. Well, that last bit wasn't entirely true. Sirius was pretty sure that he was a bit more enthusiastic about Remus being queer than James was, but their friend didn't have to know that. James studied him for a moment, narrowing his eyes, and Sirius felt an absurd surge of fondness for his friend. There's nothing wrong with him being who he is. Sirius wished, desperately, that he had someone to tell him that years ago. He had to swallow the lump in his throat. Eventually, Prongs clapped him on the back, satisfied. Well, all right then. Glad we're on the same page. You have no idea, Sirius thought, shaking his head fondly as they continued back towards the rest of their friends. Showered and fed, everyone seemed to have perked up a little bit, and weren't quite so green around the gills, in the case of Dorcas and Marlene. Once everyone had shoved their valuables into rucksacks and zipped up their tents, grabbing their leftover pasties and a few water bottles for good measure, they started off on the 5-mile hike towards the castle. The path they followed ran along the shore, twisting up to the steep cliff. Sirius raced to the top with Mary and Marlene, laughing. Marlene won, which he attributed to all of Potter's insane Quidditch drills, and the view at the top was breathtaking. The sea looked less grey and more blue today, sparkling brilliantly in the sunlight. Sirius slung an arm around Mary's shoulders. One day, he declared, staring out at the water, I'm going to live by the sea. Mary snorted. I don't see too many mansions on the beach, Black. He scoffed, feigning offence. I'll have you know that living in a mansion is extremely overrated, MacDonald. I'll do just fine in a cosy little fisherman's cottage, I think. Oh, right, she laughed, shrugging him off. I can see it now. Sirius Black, the humble fisherman. You never know. Fishing could be one of my hidden talents. He was so distracted bickering with Mary that he didn't notice a good half an hour into the hike that James and Remus had fallen behind. So far behind, in fact, that they were no longer in sight. They'll catch up to us at the ruins, Lilly assured him, but Sirius felt a twist of guilt as he thought of Remus's bad leg, the limp he tried to hide, which got worse after the moon. He dragged Lilly over to the little information kiosk as soon as they reached the castle, trying to figure out if there was any other ways to get back to the campsite. James and Remus arrived half an hour behind the rest of the group, and Remus sat down almost immediately, wincing and rubbing his hip. Sorry, Sirius said, once James had hurried off over to Lilly. I didn't think.
I'm fine, Remus assured him with a tired smile. I had prongs.
There's a local bus that goes back to the campsite, Sirius offered. I checked. We can get it back if you want.
I'm fine.
The ruins themselves were lovely, remnants of what had once been a grand structure, crumbling staircases, thick stone walls, sturdy parapets. The sea lay far below, glittering like a jewel. Sirius tried to imagine what the castle would have looked like when it was occupied, torches flickering along the walls, hall full of lords and ladies, princes and princesses, kings and queens. James discovered a stray pile of sticks that someone had thrown into a corner, which quickly led to an improvised sword fight between him, Sirius and Peter. Remus sat a little way away, rolling his cigarettes and talking to Marlene. Eventually, Peter clambered on top of one of the crumbling walls and declared himself a dragon, which naturally meant that Sirius had to play the knight and do his very best to knock the other boy off his perch. James was supposed to be helping him, but he'd run off, shouting, "I have to save the princess!" before sweeping Lilly into his arms. She laughed, delighted, and tried to squirm away as he threw her over his shoulder. After they'd spent a while mucking about, some of the Muggle tourists began to grumble. They decided it was time to head back down to the campsite, where they could cool off by the sea. James and Lilly walked ahead, hand in hand, and James smiled as he watched them, still half wondering if he'd somehow stumbled into one of James's fantasies. It seemed almost impossible that after 5 years he had finally gotten what he'd always wanted. But then again, Sirius thought as he glanced over at Remus, maybe getting the things one wanted wasn't always as impossible as it seemed. "You go ahead," he called out. "Me and Mooney are going to hang back for a fag break." Marlene, who had been hanging back by Remus, tutted and hurried off to catch the rest of the group. Sirius settled down on the stone wall next to Mooney, lighting up one of the cigarettes he'd just rolled. "There's a pump down there," Sirius jerked his chin towards the lane. "Saw it on the way up. It's got a garden. Do you want to go waste some time?"
"Yeah," Remus blinked, looking a bit surprised. "But don't you want to catch up with James?"
"James doesn't love me anymore," Sirius swooned theoretically, sighing. "His heart has been claimed by another."
Remus laughed, then smiled slyly. "Oh well, you've got me."
"I've got you," Sirius agreed, as a fuzzy sort of warmth spread through the top of his head and all the way down to his toes. He hopped off the wall. "Come on then. Could murder a pint." The pub was a quaint little building. Whitewashed walls and red-tiled roof, mustard-yellow shutters, and potted geraniums perched next to the door. It wasn't quite so sunny inside. The lighting was very dim, and the ceiling was so low that Remus had to duck slightly as they entered. A few muggles turned to look at them. Mostly older men sat along the bar. Sirius paid them no mind, delighted to be inside his first muggle pub. He ordered 2 pints of lager and carried them outside to the little garden, where he settled down on the table that was shaded by a beech tree. Remus followed him, glancing back once nervously at the surly barman. He reminded Sirius of the one at the Hogshead. "It's great here," Sirius said, taking a swig of his beer. "Do you think we could live here, when it's all over?" He thought again of his fisherman's cottage, waking in the morning to the smell of the sea, walking along the beach with Remus, buying buttery pasties from the little shop and drinking pints in the pub garden.
"I like London," Remus said. "It's what I'm used to."
"Remember when you promised we could go to Carnaby Street?" Sirius reminded him. "This summer. I'm holding you to it."
"When did I say that?"
"Christmas."
"Oh, right. Okay then, we'll go."
"I can't believe you forgot."
"Well," Remus raised an eyebrow, "you also spent half of Christmas trying to convince me to get a girlfriend, so—"
"Oh," Sirius groaned, thinking back on all his comments. They'd made so much more sense to him at the time, but seemed so utterly ridiculous now. "Sorry. I thought it might help me, feel less attached to you. Sounds a bit bonkers now I think about it."
"Now it sounds bonkers." Remus rolled his eyes, smiling.
"Logical thought processes are not my forte, Mr. Mooney." Sirius tossed his hair out of his face, laughing. "You ought to make your peace with it if you're going to... if we're going to..."
"Start going out." Remus filled in, sipping his beer. Sirius smiled sheepishly. Going out? Yeah, he repeated. Sorry. You'll get there, Remus said lightly, taking another swig of his drink. And just like that, they were talking, really talking, no longer dancing around all the things they wanted to say. They worked their way through the months of miscommunications, baffling each other with their ineptitude to work out what the other had been thinking. Sirius would listen in shock as Remus recounted his assumptions, his interpretations of their interactions, the meanings he had taken from things that Sirius had said. He'd shake his head, frowning, insisting earnestly, "But Mooney, it wasn't like that at all." Sirius felt daft looking back on it, for all his own assumptions about what Remus was thinking, and more than a little guilty for the grief he'd caused as he'd struggled to hide his feelings away. At the same time, he was a bit baffled by how oblivious Remus had been. He'd been so sure that the other boy had cottoned on, had figured out how desperately Sirius wanted him. They went over everything, going back to 5th year. They even talked about Mary. I really did like her, Sirius tried to explain. I think that's what threw me off in the beginning. You know, it wasn't like the girls weren't doing it for me in that department. And she was so confident. I thought you were just with her because you didn't want to be with me. No, Sirius assured him. That's a horrible thought. It was for her, not for you. He caught his eye, adding, Sorry. Don't be. If it makes you feel better. That makes me feel better, actually. Anyway, Sirius shrugged at him. What about you and Mary? Oh, God. Remus covered his face with his hands. Don't. I'm so embarrassed. It's fine. I liked it. It was true. It was much easier to forget about the spike of anxiety, the undercurrent of jealousy, now that Sirius knew how little it had meant. Much easier to focus, instead, on the heat that it sent curling through him. I noticed. Remus flushed, looking away. Didn't help you feel less attached, then? Apparently not. I couldn't believe you didn't mind that. And yet, when you found out about Chris... Sirius frowned, thinking back on the mousy little prefect. Him. There's nothing between us, Remus said with a bemused smile. We're just friends. And this other bloke, Grant, was he... Sirius swallowed, fighting off the discomfort that came with the question. Your boyfriend? Not really, Remus shrugged. It's hard to explain. He's a friend. I care about him as much as I do you, and James, and Peter, and the girls. More secrets, Remus. Sirius sighed in exasperation, tugging his fingers through his hair. I can't keep track. I don't know how you do it. Can you stop hiding stuff from me? At least. I don't know. Remus swallowed. It'll be hard. But you could try, Sirius prompted gently. Remus gave him a small smile, nodding. Once they'd finished their drinks, they started back down towards the trail of the campsite. I'll teach you how to swim, Sirius said, smirking. Fuck off, will you? Remus rolled his eyes. Is there anything else you've been keeping secret, Remu? He grinned, leaning over to nudge his shoulder. Nope. Remus smiled up at the sky, laughing. Queer, illiterate, homeless, werewolf. He held up a finger for each one, like he was checking them off a list. I think that's it. Oh, and my mother. Your mother? I got a letter in that box of depressing stuff from Dumbledore. Photos and a letter. An apology. Oh, blimey, okay. What did it... No, I don't want to talk about it yet. Sorry. Fine, Sirius agreed easily. Let's say we can talk about anything at all, except our mothers. Perfect. Remus grinned.
In the tourist jam, round the Notre Dame, our last summer, walking hand in hand, Paris restaurants, our last summer, morning croissants, living for the day, Paris far away, our last summer.
Part 4. In the years that followed, Sirius would look back on that week in Cornwall often. He would think about it when he was lonely, or scared, or so tired that he could hardly lift his wand. when he wondered whether it was all worth it, what they were even fighting for. Those were the moments he would close his eyes, remembering the days in green grass and warm sand, wandering through the whitewashed village, ice cream melting on their tongues and fingers. He would think about nights in a tent with Remus, young and joyful and mad for each other, and remind himself that at the end of everything they would have those days again. At the time, of course, he had no idea how rare it would be, that raw and filtered happiness. At the time he thought it would last forever, could not imagine ever looking at Remus, knee-deep in the ocean, jeans rolled up, smelling of salt water, and feeling anything but a love so sweet that it made his jaw ache. In those moments he would transform into Padfoot, who was much better equipped to handle the blinding joy, who would bark and run and chase the sticks that Remus threw, thinking nothing but mine, 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 mine. Of course, he couldn't transform around the others, but that was all right, as the two boys found themselves spending quite a bit more time alone than they had expected to, due largely to the fact that they were not the only couple on the trip. Peter and Dorcas were at least discreet about it, which was mostly thanks to Dorcas, who seemed to find public snogging distasteful unless she was drunk. But James and Lily were a completely different story. It seemed that now the floodgates had opened, there was nothing holding either of them back. "You're supposed to be prefects," Mary shouted on the third night of the trip, when she nearly tripped over the two of them as they lay horizontally in front of the campfire. "Oh, as if I haven't caught you 100 times on my rounds," Lily laughed, extricating herself from James's arms and straightening her shirt. "And you, Black, you can stop leering." "What?" Sirius asked innocently. He had just returned from the shower block with a large bowl they used for washing dishes, a chore that he had so far taken charge of every night. The others seemed a bit surprised by this, but he had always found the work relaxing, ever since he was young and his mother had forced him to do it in place of Creature as punishment. Of course, he had never actually let her catch on to the fact that he liked the chore. "Don't draw me into your sordid escapades," he said primly as he set the tub down. "I've been a perfect gentleman all holiday." "I'm not convinced you haven't been sneaking off with some mugger girl in the village," Marlene teased. She was stretched out on the ground, sunbathing atop one of the beach towels in her underwear. Sirius took the opportunity to flick her with a damp towel, making her yelp and curl up. "How dare you," he sniffed. "I've been tucked up in bed early every night, haven't I, Mooney?" Remus, who had been chewing a handful of crackers, began immediately to choke, spewing crumbs as he coughed. James had to lean over and slap him on the back, and Sirius pressed his fist to his mouth to keep from laughing. No one seemed to find the comment strange, though Remus glared at Sirius after he'd finished coughing. In fact, none of their friends seemed to suspect anything at all. James was suspicious about the fact they were sharing a tent, though for vastly different reasons. "You're not going to start fighting again, you two?" he'd asked, once he'd calmed down enough about the Lily Evans event to actually pay attention to his surroundings again. "You know you only wind each other up if you're in too close a proximity." "Right you are, Prongs," Sirius responded cheerfully. "You bunk with Mooney and I'll share with Evans." That was the end of that conversation, though not of James's newfound protectiveness over Remus. Sirius almost found it amusing, particularly when he was the one receiving the end of Potter's warning glances and pointed looks. Even funnier how much it perplexed Remus, who, near the end of the week, confessed to Sirius, "Honestly, I'm a bit surprised that no one's mentioned it." They had just finished walking along the beach, pausing every few feet for Remus to examine a seashell or a small stone. He would pick them up, turn them over in his fingers, and then either drop them back into the sand or slip them into his pocket. Sirius had been trying to figure out if there was a pattern to the ones he was keeping, but so far he had been unable to find one. Now they lounged on a private stretch of sand that no one else seemed to know about, and Sirius laughed at the mildly put-out expression on Mooney's face. "Well, if Prongs gave everyone else that bloody speech, I'm not surprised." "Speech?" "Yeah, he pulled me aside and told me if I started treating you any differently, then he'd thump me. Probably didn't say that in front of the girls. Maybe Lily did them." He stretched out on his stomach, resting his head atop of his hands. Next to him, Remus was staring, a warm, possessive look that made Sirius's stomach flip. Every so often the other boy would pour a silky handful of sand across his back, and the grains would tickle as they slid lightly over his skin. "You're having me on," Remus said, disbelieving, as he dumped more sand over Sirius. I wish I was. I swear it was so hard not to laugh in his face and just tell him everything. He brushed the sand from his back as he rolled over, raising an eyebrow. I'm going to have to go wash off in a minute if you keep doing that. That's an idea, Remus smirked devilishly, and Sirius's heart stuttered. Oh, Merlin. The subject didn't come up again until the last day of the trip, when they were all struggling to dismantle and pack up their tents. Remus took charge of the boys, picking up the instructions and barking orders. The girls had finished 30 minutes before, and had gone down to the beach for one last dip in the water before they left. Right, that peg needs to come out first. There's one sort of top sheet that you need to remove, otherwise everything gets tangled up. He squinted down at the paper as James and Sirius found the top sheet, successfully removing it so that they could fold up the canvas tent. What would we do without you, Moony? James grinned, shaking his head. Yeah, Peter piped up, picking the pegs up off the ground. Who'd have thought you'd be good at all this stuff? Sirius paused, blinking. Had he really? Well, I always have to be the sensible one, Remus said absent-mindedly, not seeming to think anything of the comment as he continued to flip through the instruction packet. But James dropped the end of the canvas, marching over to Peter. What do you mean, this stuff? He demanded, arms crossed over his chest. The smaller boy gulped nervously. You know, outdoorsy stuff. Blokey stuff. I didn't mean... But it was very clear what he'd meant. Sirius swallowed, the echo of so many other comments swimming in his head. Pete, a word. It was a command more than a question, said in James's best Quidditch captain voice, as he marched off towards the beach. Peter trailed behind him, looking very pale. Blokey stuff, Sirius muttered, flapping the canvas sharply as he went back to folding it. What's all that about? Remus demanded, looking utterly confused as he began to collect the pegs that Pete had dropped. But Sirius just shook his head, anger and embarrassment tangled stickily in his stomach. He'd calmed down a bit by the time they were saying their goodbyes, though he still avoided looking at Peter, not when the other boy could have any idea why he was so upset. Everyone seemed to be a little emotional as they prepared to leave the campsite that they had made their home over the past week. James and Lilly more than anyone, kissing passionately as if they weren't going to see each other again for a few short weeks. Are you going back to Essex, Remus? Mary asked, smiling. Staying with the Potters for a bit, he replied, answering smile a bit strained. Lucky. I've got to go back to Croydon. Marlene invited me to stay, but Mum says she doesn't see enough of me as it is. That's nice, Remus said, voice a bit wistful. It's nice to be missed. Peter and Dorcas sent off first, waving as they headed up towards the main road to search for a good spot to hail the night bus. Sirius frowned at Peter's retreating form, but Remus waved as though there were nothing wrong. Mary, Marlene and Lilly apparated once they'd managed to extract Lilly from James's arms. She embraced him one last time, then turned to hug Remus, and then, to the utter surprise of the entire group, even threw her arms around Sirius. He patted her back awkwardly. Once the others had left, the three boys apparated back to James's house. Sirius landed in the village and had to make the trek back, meaning that he was the last to arrive. Mrs. Potter fussed over the three of them and sat them down at once for some proper food. Should we get in touch with the home for you, Remus? She asked as they sat around the dinner table. You're not pulling another vanishing act, are you? Can't have that muggle police call again. Oh, no, Sirius could see his mind spinning, searching for some excuse. He gave Remus a sharp kick under the table and a meaningful look. Go on, Moony, tell the truth. The other boy met his eye, swallowing, then turned back to Mrs. Potter. Actually, now I'm 17, there isn't a place for me at St. Edmund's. Oh, good. James's mum smiled brightly. We've got you all summer then. Wonderful. Later that night, as he slipped into Remus's bed, Sirius couldn't resist whispering, I told you so. The Potters love taking in strays. Should you be here? Remus whispered back, nervously. What about James? Snoring his head off. I could hear him through the wall. That seemed to satisfy him. Remus sighed as he wrapped an arm around Sirius, drawing him closer. Well done for telling them, Sirius murmured, twisting their fingers together under the covers, running his thumb along a scar on the back of Mooney's hand. "Yeah, I'm just telling everyone everything this week." Remus huffed a laugh. "Nothing wrong with asking for help, Mooney. People like helping their friends." "I know." Remus kissed the top of his head, and Sirius smiled against his chest, curling their fingers tighter together. He had never felt as safe, as peaceful as he did when he was lying next to Remus. It scared him, sometimes, how much more difficult it had become to sleep alone. "Sirius." "That thing Wormtail said, did it really upset you?" Sirius tensed instinctively, thinking of the little twist in Peter's voice. "Who'd have thought you'd be good at all this stuff?" Remus seemed to sense his discomfort, backtracking. "Just, Pete, he's a bit of an idiot sometimes, but he's just thick, not spiteful. He'll get used to it, get used to me. Next time he needs his own work done, it won't matter." "I've just heard stuff like that before, that's all," Sirius mumbled into Remus's pyjama shirt. "About being a man, the sort of thing." "From your mother?" Sirius nodded very slightly against his chest. Remus squeezed his hand. "Well then, you know that it was all bollocks." Saturday the 30th of July, 1977. By the end of their first fortnight back at the Potters, Sirius had spent precisely 14 hours sitting outside in the phone box at the end of the road. Every day he and Remus would walk down with James, who would bounce on his heels and fiddle with his glasses and forget how to operate the phone immediately upon their arrival, leaving Remus to sigh and roll his eyes and crowd into the little booth to dial Lily's number for the poor smitten sod. He would then huff and exit the box, sitting on the wall next to Sirius, smoking. On the 14th iteration of this routine, Remus shook his head and shut the glass panel door behind him. "Bloody idiot," he muttered. "How hard is it to remember a few simple steps? He did Muggle studies. Don't they explain this stuff?" "Oh, he gets too excited to remember anything." Sirius nudged Mooney's shoulder, grinning. "Have some sympathy for the lovesick fool." "No, I will be joyless and miserable forever." Remus scowled, searching in his pockets for his Muggle lighter. "Oh good, I love it when you get all dark and moody." "Fuck off." Oh yeah, call me a stupid prat. That really gets me going." Sirius laughed, only half teasing. There was something to be said for the broody Remus, with those dark eyes. The other boy shoved him off the wall, sending him stumbling a few steps. "You are being a stupid prat." "Only for you," Sirius winked, stubbing out his cigarette. A rumbling growl began in the distance, and Sirius's heart leapt as he reached to grab Remus's hand, shouting, "Look! Here it comes, right on time!" As if by magic, it appeared, the most beautiful, spectacular, breathtaking contraption that Sirius had ever had the good fortune to lay his eyes on. A motorbike. More specifically, a Triumph Bonneville T120. It roared through the village at the same time every evening as they waited for James to finish his call, in a scream of steel and chrome and silver, cherry-red tank winking in the setting sun. Sirius was sure that if he could ride it just once, he would die a happy man. Presently, though, he settled for watching it drive by, sighing in satisfaction as he clambered back up on the wall once it was gone. With the motorbike out of sight, he turned back to Remus, studying his face. The taller boy was frowning, puffing on his cigarette, that familiar little furrow between his brows that Sirius wanted to lean over and smooth away with his thumb. "Is it the moon?" he asked, "making you grumpy?" "Probably," Remus exhaled. "Usually makes me restless." "Yeah, I noticed last night." Sirius licked his lips, remembering the way Remus had nipped his neck, pinning his wrists into the mattress. "Oh my god, shut up, you obnoxious prick." Sirius smirked and stuck his tongue out playfully. Remus wasn't the only one nervous about the moon. Sirius was anxious as well. The Potters had decided that the safest thing would be to lock Remus in the attic, which they had already reinforced with various defensive spells. That wasn't the part that Sirius was worried about, though. The part that worried Sirius was Moody, who would be standing guard outside, making it quite impossible for either himself or James to sneak in. Sirius still had half a mind to try, suggesting that he use the invisibility cloak, but James had talked him out of it, insisting that even if they managed to get somehow in, they still wouldn't be able to explain how a dog and a stag mysteriously materialized overnight. So on the night of the moon, Remus bid them good night, and Sirius watched him disappear into the attic. He tried to sleep, but he found it impossible. He could hear the wolf, 2 floors above, howling and whining and scrabbling about. Eventually, Sirius stuck into Mooney's room, transforming into Padfoot and curling up at the foot of his bed, breathing in his scent. He woke early the next morning to change and creep back into his own room before anyone might suspect anything, yawning as he tramped downstairs for breakfast. When Remus came down an hour later, his hands were covered completely by bandages. Sirius's heart twisted in his chest. He watched Mooney eat, struggling to hold his fork, and wincing every time he had to bend his fingers. Sirius clutched his own fork in his fist, gripping it until his knuckles turned white. At night, Sirius would crawl into Remus's bed, curling into him and whispering into his ear. "Tell me a secret," he'd breathed. "Tell me something no one knows." And Remus would tell him, offering tiny, hidden pieces of himself, like treasure. Sirius tucked them away in his heart, glittering and golden and precious. "I'm the one who told Philomena Pettigrew to go to America." "You never." "Yep, in the bathroom on Christmas Eve." "Sly bastard. How'd you get girls falling all over each other to talk to you, eh? What's your secret?" "Maybe they just trust me because they know I'm not trying to get off with them." "An intriguing thought. Tell me another secret." I don't know. I've told you everything." "No, you haven't," Sirius smiled, pressing their lips together, crawling on top of him, hands sliding underneath Remus's shirt. He traced the patterns of scars on his ribs, his stomach, his chest. "I'm going to know everything about you one day. I promise." Remus kissed him. Another secret, the most precious of all. Part 5. Monday, the 29th of August, 1977. For the second full moon, Moody bound Remus to the bed in the attic. Sirius thought it was barbaric, but Remus insisted that he didn't mind. The wolf did, though. He howled all night long, mournful sounds that tugged at Sirius's heart. Despite the noise, however, Remus appeared to be in better shape. There were no open wounds, no bandages when he came downstairs. He was dressed in a new set of robes that Mrs. Potter had left him in his room, and when he asked James about it, the other boy grinned. "They're for going out in," he said, taking a bite of his toast. "Diagon Alley today." There were only a handful of days left before they'd be boarding the Hogwarts Express, and it had been decided by the boys that they would spend the remainder of their summer in Diagon Alley. Mr. and Mrs. Potter were leaving for a few weeks, and though they refused to share any details about their trip, James was certain that it was something to do with Dumbledore. According to Moody, Diagon Alley was crawling with undercover auras, and everyone seemed satisfied that it would be safe enough for the 3 boys. Their Hogwarts letters had arrived just a week before, and when James opened the envelope, a shiny gold pin fell out. He gasped for a moment. Then, bloody hell! Sirius squinted at the engraved letters. Head boy. "What the fuck?" "Language," Mrs. Potter tutted, but she'd been smiling, clearly delighted. Of course, James hadn't been keen to wait around for his parents to fuss over him. He'd rushed immediately to write a letter to Lilly, sending it off by owl, and waiting eagerly next to the window until, 20 minutes later, they discovered that Lily Evans had been named head girl. "It's fate," James crowed. "Destiny!" They travelled by Flue Powder to the Leaky Cauldron, a cosy, if a little tatty around the edges, pub that doubled as a B&B and sort of all-purpose meeting place for any wizards coming in and out of Diagon Alley. James had set them up with 2 twin rooms, and after checking in, they lugged their trunks upstairs. Neither Sirius nor Remus had been able to come up with an excuse about why they should share, so Sirius was with James, and Remus was with Peter. The rooms were adjoining, not that it made much difference. Sirius doubted that there would be any sneaking into each other's beds unnoticed, not with the creaky floorboards and the absence of bed curtains. Diagon Alley was jam-packed, as it usually was near the end of summer, with students and their parents stocking up on school supplies. The marauders stopped by Gringotts first, where the goblins were extremely accommodating. They found Lyle Lupin's vault, and Sirius was shocked to see how little Remus's father had left him. He had always known that the Lupins hadn't had much, but still, it hardly looked like enough to last Remus a year out of school. But that doesn't matter, Sirius reminded himself firmly. I've got more than enough for the both of us. Remus, who was still recovering from the full moon, was dead on his feet by the time they finished at the bank, and looked more than a little embarrassed about it. The others assured him that it was fine, urging him to go back to the leaky cauldron and lie down. James wanted to spend the rest of the afternoon in quality Quidditch supplies anyway, Sirius told him. We can leave the rest of the shopping for tomorrow. That seemed to be enough for Remus, and he bid them farewell, yawning. As promised, the remaining 3 marauders spent the afternoon looking at the newest broom models on display, purchasing the fancy broom polish that James liked, and rifling through Quidditch weekly magazines. By when they returned to the leaky cauldron, Remus was still sound asleep. They ate dinner without him, staying at their corner table in the pub late into the night, as James ordered a round of fire whiskey. "We're celebrating, lads," he declared, raising his glass. "Our final year at Hogwarts. It'll be the best one yet." Now that he had finally won over Lily Evans, James seemed convinced of his invincibility. Peter and Sirius raised their own glasses, cheering. 2 hours later, James was slumped against Sirius's shoulder, slurring drunkenly. "I think I'm in love with her." Peter had his head down on the table, snoring. Sirius shoved James upright. "Bloody hell, mate," he laughed. "You've only been going out with her for a few weeks." "Does that matter?" James mumbled, smiling dopily. "She's like everything she does. Just look at her, and I think, that's my person. Do you know what I mean?" Sirius hummed, non-committal. "Come on, don't pass out. I need you to help me get Pete upstairs." It was past midnight by the time they stumbled up to bed, managing by some miracle to avoid waking Remus. The next morning, James was just as chipper and energetic as always, though Peter looked a bit green round the gills. Lily arrived, and she and Remus immediately set about organising a schedule to ensure they got all their shopping done. Under their careful direction, the marauders found themselves purchasing everything on their lists by lunchtime, stopping back at the leaky cauldron to drop their things and eating before heading to Flora and Fortescue's. Sirius insisted on buying Remus, who had never been to Diagon Alley before, a scoop of every flavour, demanding that he chose his favourite. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon by the time they were finishing up their ice cream, and Sirius didn't think anything of it when Remus popped off to the gents, too busy watching Peter attempt to levitate a glob of milkshake into his mouth on a dare from James. He almost succeeded, but overshot, letting the runny ice cream drop all over his nose. Peter spluttered comically, sending all 3 of the others into stitches. Sirius was still laughing when Remus returned. "All right, Moony," he grinned, once he'd caught his breath. "This lot want to go do some sightseeing stuff. That sounds boring. Want to bunk off down Carnaby Street, finally." "Yeah, great," Remus said, smiling tightly, voice strained. He widened his eyes meaningfully, as if to say, "We need to talk." Sirius frowned and hurried over to where he was hovering a few feet away from their table, leaving James and Lily to help Peter clean up the ice cream he'd just spilt. "What's up?" he asked quietly. "You look a right state." "We have to go find Grunt," Remus whispered, frantic. "Look." He shoved his pocket watch towards Sirius's face. The needle on the enchanted compass was spinning wildly. "Right now?" Sirius asked. "But we're going to—" "No," Remus interrupted. "I can't explain it, I just have to. I know I have to. Can you tell James and Peter something? I don't know what. Just if they ask." "What? No, I'm coming with you." "Sirius." "Remus?" Sirius gave him a look, raising a brow. After a moment, Remus sighed. "Okay, fine." "Shall we just tell the others we're going?" "No. Don't argue with me on this." Remus was frowning, eyes darting periodically down to the whirring arrow on the compass. Sirius studied his face for a moment. The last time he had seen Mooney so upset had been that night in the common room, where they talked about the werewolf. The night before he disappeared. "All right," he said quietly. "I won't argue."
So strong it tears their hearts to see through the fleeting hours of morning. Love is careless, mischoosing, sweeping over cross and lightly. Love descends on those defenseless.
Everything happened very quickly after that. They told the others that they were heading to Carnaby Street, before paying for their ice cream and hurrying back to the Leaky Cauldron to change into Muggle clothes. Sirius let Remus take the lead once they left Diagon Alley, following him to a station where they caught 2 different tubes and ended up in Mile End. It took Sirius a moment to recognise where they were. He'd only been there as a dog. The squat was just as run down as he remembered, mildewing and graffitied. One of the windows had been smashed in and hastily repaired with duct tape. Sirius followed Mooney as he stomped down the cracked tile hallway, hovering behind him as he knocked on the door. It took a few minutes for someone to answer, and a few more minutes to locate someone that Remus actually seemed to recognise. The boy who came to the door was far too skinny, with a far-away look in his eye and sallow skin. When Remus asked after Grant, the boy scratched his head. "Grant? Yeah, I think he went down west, when it got a bit too rough around here. Hammersmith, maybe. Knocking at this place down next week. I'm going to Brixton."
"Hammersmith?" Remus yelped. "That's the other side of town."
"Yeah, he made some friends out there, I reckon. Grant's always good at making friends when it suits him."
His voice grew sour on that last part, and Remus bristled, straightening and squaring his shoulders. The skinny boy gave him an irritated look, snapping, "Look, if you don't want to be found, he won't be." But of course, Remus wasn't giving up. They caught another tube across the city, and Sirius tried not to get too distracted by the funny moving Muggle staircases and the ticket barriers, focusing on the mission at hand. Still, it was hard not to stop and stare as they exited the tube, walking past houses and Muggle shops, passing by crowds of Muggles all dressed in their crazy clothes. "It's amazing," Sirius said, watching a huge double-decker bus zoom past. "I've lived in London all my life, and I've never seen it like this." "Glad you're having fun," Remus replied, sounding a bit harried. He had started to wince every time he put weight on one leg, and kept taking the compass out to glance at the wavering needle.
"Let's sit down for a minute, shall we?" Sirius suggested gently. "Look, there's a park over there."
"Not sure I'll be able to stand back up if I sit down now," Remus muttered, eyeing the benches warily.
"Then I'll carry you," Sirius told him.
"Oh, piss off, will you?" Remus rolled his eyes, but he relented, leaning forward and pulling the compass back out of his pocket. "Ugh, it's going mental again." He tugged his fingers through his hair anxiously. "I thought I was getting somewhere."
"It might be because you're agitated," Sirius suggested, sitting beside him. Because it feeds off your emotion towards the person you're looking for. So maybe if you—"
"Are you telling me to calm down?" Remus scowled.
"It might help," Sirius shrugged. "How about you tell me something about Grant? Something nice."
He was desperately curious anyway. That wasn't what this was about. This was about helping Remus. The other boy eyed him skeptically. "If you think it will help." He sighed. His name's Grant Chapman. I met him at St. Edmunds in 1975. He liked the same music as me. He's friendly.
What does he look like?"
"You've seen him?"
"Not properly. I was a dog. Anyway, the point is to get you to think about him."
"I'm doing nothing but thinking about him," Remus responded roughly.
Before Sirius could reply, he shut his eyes and took a steadying breath. "Fair hair. Curls. I think blue eyes. Yeah, blue. He has a crooked front tooth. The last time I saw him he was thinner." He frowned, eyes still closed. "Go on," Sirius prompted. "You like the same music. So, Bowie, T-Rex."
"Yeah, and you like some deep purple. Cool. Okay, so that's how you became friends? Yeah. Remus seemed to be relaxing a bit. He was the only one at St. Eddie's that wasn't a complete maniac or a criminal. I mean, he had a few charges, but not serious. Then one day, he just kissed me, and that's how I knew. He glanced sheepishly at Sirius, who plastered a smile onto his face, nodding at him to keep going. He's been a good friend apart from that, Remus said, fiddling with his hands. He never makes me feel bad about myself. Never makes me feel too odd or different. He sounds like a really great mate, Sirius managed to say. Yeah, and he'd do anything for me. That's why I need to. Remus trailed off, staring down at the compass. When Sirius glanced over his shoulder, the arrow was clearly pointing west. Still shaking a little, but clear enough. Remus stood abruptly, and Sirius followed him. The sun was beginning to set. It was past 7 now, and neither of them had eaten anything since lunch. Sirius reminded himself, vaguely, to contact James with the mirror soon, so that they wouldn't worry. But for the moment he concentrated on following Remus, who was staring at the little golden compass with an intense concentration, mumbling to himself, and sniffing every so often. They left the park behind for a more crowded row of pubs and restaurants, where the pavements were packed with people. Sirius tried not to stare at the colourful outfits. The muggles were wearing everything from sequins to leather-studded jackets, and some of them had strange, shaggy hair or piercings on their face. His mother would have had a fit. They had just turned into another street when Remus stopped dead, staring. There, he said firmly, pointing across the road to a building with loud music thumping from within. Blacked-out windows and people stumbling up and down the stairs to the basement. He's in there. It was incredibly loud. In addition to the music, voices could be heard, screaming and shouting and wild with laughter. Teenagers stood in packs outside, with bright hair glued into spikes. Sirius studied them, fascinated. "Should we go in?" he asked. Remus hesitated, staring at the entryway, and the bouncer began to yell. "Sling your hook, you fucking Nancy boy!" he shouted, as a young man staggered upstairs to the street, hands shoved in his pockets. It was hard to make out any defining features other than the messy blonde hair, but that seemed to be enough for Remus. "Grunt!" Remus didn't even stop to look before dashing across the street, and something twisted in Sirius's chest. He followed after, more cautiously. Grant had apparently not heard Remus shouting, that or he was ignoring him, because he continued to stumble down the street. He was hunched, walking funny, and Sirius drew closer. He could smell that the boy reeked of alcohol. The muggles in front of the pub began shouting, flinging words that made Sirius cringe. Familiar words, familiar insults. Suppose that's the same anywhere then, he thought bitterly. But Grant didn't cringe. He spun around, scowling, and held up 2 wobbling fingers as he stumbled back, nearly tipping over his own feet. "Grant!" Remus shouted again, and this time the boy seemed to hear him, turning and squinting under the yellow streetlight. "Jesus Christ! What are you doing here?" He stumbled again, clearly drunk, and slumped against the wall, clutching his side as if he were in pain. Sirius hovered a few feet behind Remus, who hurried over. "Looking for you." He ducked his head, trying to see the other boy's face. "Right, obviously. Bloody hell, how do you even manage it every time?" He doesn't seem very friendly, Sirius thought of it spitefully, and immediately felt guilty, kicking himself. Grant had clearly had a rough time of it. He was almost as skinny as the boy from the squat, with dirty hair and a startling line of purple bruises across the side of his face, which disappeared under the collar of his shirt. "What happened to you?" Remus asked, reaching out helplessly as if he could touch him. "Fucking punk happened, didn't he?" Grant released a noise that was either a laugh or a cough, staggering and sitting down heavily on the filthy pavement. "Sorry, mate. Bit dizzy." He leaned over and retched a few times. When nothing came up, he spat. Remus squatted down next to him, studying him with a tender expression that Sirius had never seen before on his face. "Who did this?" He stretched out a hand towards the bruises. "Did it happen in there?"
Get off. Grant swung at his arm, and Sirius felt a hot flash of anger, leaping forwards to pull Remus back. Oi, back off, mate. Grant squinted up at him, raising a hand to block the light from the street lamps. He blinked, then sneered sourly. Who the fuck are you? Piss off, will you? I'm talking to my mate. Sirius stifled the urge to shove him as he turned back to Remus. Fancy a pint? He began to wobble to his feet, and Remus stood quickly, gripping his elbow to help him up. Grant's eyes flashed with clarity for a moment, as he asked, Got cash? Yeah, course. Remus began to steer him away from the busy street. Come on, I'll buy you dinner. What'd you like? Oh, you know me. I'm easy, Grant slurred, laughing maniacally as he leaned against Remus. Sirius followed behind them, watching Grant warily in case he swung out again. But he seemed to have calmed down a bit by the time they reached the cafe. In here? Remus asked, turning to look over his shoulder at Sirius. He glanced inside at the grubby plastic chairs and sticky-looking tables. Probably the best we'll find around here. You again? Grant frowned, clearly just noticing him. Thought I told you to naff off. Grant, Remus said softly, this is Sirius, my friend from school. The other boy turned to look at him again, squinting. Well, fuck me, he swayed a bit, muttering. Proper stunner. Sirius didn't know how to respond to that. Luckily, he didn't have to, as Remus hurried the drunken boy over gently to a table. He manoeuvred Grant into a chair, ordering 3 cups of tea and some food. I don't want any trouble from you, the surly, white-aproned muggle said, as he set down their mugs of tea. I know your types. Piss off, you dirty old man, Grant grumbled. I bet you'd pay for it if you could. What did I say? Look, Remus scrambled to his feet in a placating gesture. He's sobering up. I'll keep him quiet, I swear. I'll pay up front. He'll be okay once he's eaten. The gruff man looked him up and down, evaluating, then glanced over at Sirius, then Grant, then Remus again. What are you? Christian Outreach? Sort of. Remus nodded earnestly. The man gave him another once-over, then shook his head and plodded back behind the counter. Caw! Grant giggled drunkenly into his mug of tea. You get posher and posher by the bloody year, Remus, me old mucker. Just please stop trying to fight everyone for 5 minutes, will you? Remus pleaded, running an exasperated hand over his face as he sat. The drunken boy blew a raspberry, still giggling. The food was gone within 5 minutes of its arrival. Grant ate like he was starving, which maybe, Sirius thought, he was. Remus ordered a Bakewell tart and more tea, concern evident in his face as he studied his friend. Where you living? He asked gently. What were you doing at the club? Getting bladdered, Grant mumbled. He seemed to have calmed down a bit more now that he'd eaten. Well, you've achieved that. The bruises? Grant straightened abruptly, staring Remus dead in the eye. His own eyes flashed with that strange clarity once more, and he reached up to touch his cheek. Got into an altercation a few days ago. He frowned. But fuck it. I'm off tomorrow. Going down to Brighton. Sick of bloody London. Sick of bloody miserable fucking London. Everyone wants to get ya. Do you over. Any way they can. Do you know what I mean? Remus stared back at him helplessly. Yeah. Sirius glanced between the two of them, then looked down at the table, feeling like he was interrupting on something private, something that he wasn't meant to see. Out of school, posh knob. Grant slurped his tea, making Sirius cringe. Oh, okay, fine. What's in Brighton? Somewhere to live? A job? How are you going to get there? I've got friends, Grant grunted, shrugging. The movement seemed to make him wince, and Remus looked at him sharply. Do you need to go to the hospital? How long have you been like this? No hospitals, Grant muttered, curling in on himself defensively. They think I'm a skaggart. Probably look like one, do I? I went to Mile End. Saw ads. That cunt. He can fuck right off and all. Look, Lend me a tenner, will you? I'm good for it. Give me your address and I'll pay you back, yeah?
Not if you're just going to get drunk off it.
Oh, Mr. High and Mighty. I'll have you know that I deserve a good drink. I've had my heart broken. You remember what that's like. He glared pointedly at Sirius, who continued to stare at the sugar bowl. Is he talking about me? He wondered. Had Remus talked to Grant about him? He was suddenly desperately curious, but it was neither the time nor the place to question them about it.
I'm really sorry, Grant, Remus said soothingly. Look, where are you sleeping at the moment?
Up the road.
Is it safe there?
Lost my key. Sirius was struck by just how foreign this conversation was to him, and how normal it seemed for Remus, who knew exactly what to ask. Sirius had never had to wonder if he'd have a place to sleep, not with James. He felt oddly guilty, as he studied the bruised boy across the table, thinking of how Remus had confessed that he was homeless that night in their tent. Was this what would have happened to him, Sirius found himself wondering, if it weren't for the Potters? They ordered more tea, and Remus pushed the tart in front of Grant. By the time he was done eating, all the belligerence was gone. He was drowsy and pliant, allowing the other boys to guide him back to the room where he was staying. It was a nicer building than the squat in Mile End, but not by much. As they tramped up the stairs, a young woman poked her head out from the neighbouring room. Her hair was a startling shade of green, and shaved down at the sides. "Grant? God, are you pissed again? Told you, vodka's not a fucking painkiller. Go to a bloody doctor." She peered curiously at Remus. "Who are you?"
A friend. I'm just here to make sure he's okay.
"He'll be fine. He gets like this." Sirius used a silent unlocking charm to get into the room, and Remus practically had to carry Grant inside, lowering him gently onto a ratty mattress on the floor. The space was very small, with no furniture other than the mattress, though there was a lamp perched atop a stack of magazines. Aside from that, the room consisted of a rusting mirror, an empty bowl, a toothbrush, a bar of soap, and a rucksack overflowing with wrinkled clothes. It was impossible to tell whether they were clean or dirty. Grant began to snore almost immediately, curling up on the mattress. Remus knelt beside him, scanning the bruises on his face. In the doorway, the green-haired girl watched them, eyes flicking over Sirius.
"He said he's going to Brighton tomorrow." Remus turned to her. "Is that true?"
"If he's got the money together for the train fare," she said, shrugging. "He said he got nicked last week. He was seeing this really rough type. Treated him like shit, poor love."
"He'll have the money," Remus promised. "Will you make sure he goes? It will be safe."
"I'm not his keeper," she said defensively, retreating into the hall. "Got enough problems." She scurried back into her room, and Sirius exchanged a glance with Remus, raising a brow. Charming.
"Shut the door," Remus commanded, withdrawing his wand and turning back to Grant.
"What the hell are you doing?" Sirius hissed, hurrying over as Remus pointed his wand at Grant's chest. "What about the statute of secrecy?"
"Oh, bugger that," the other boy growled. "I can't just leave him like this."
Sirius knew better than to argue, but he still frowned as he stepped back and watched Remus attempt to heal Grant's injuries. When he was done, he leaned back and scrubbed a hand over his face.
"Right. I think I need to stay here tonight." He looked up at Sirius. "I could leave him some money, but I think it's better if I make sure he gets to Brighton tomorrow, if that's still what he wants to do when he's sober."
"Right," Sirius said slowly. "We've got to get to King's Cross, though."
"Yeah. I'll be on time. I can apparate from Victoria."
"Okay," Sirius agreed, nodding. He sat down and leaned against the wall, shrugging off his jacket to use it as a cushion.
"What are you doing?" Remus hissed. "You need to get back to Diagon Alley."
Sirius resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "No, I don't," he said simply. "I can stay."
"But James—"
"Oh, right, yeah, hang on." He dug into his pocket for the mirror, holding it close to his face as he whispered, "Oi! Potter, you there?" There was a moment of fumbling, then, "Padfoot, you lunatic, where are you?" "Hiya. Look, me and Mooney are going to this gig here. We'll be in late." "A gig?" Sirius nodded, trying to feign excitement. "Don't tell anyone, okay? See you tomorrow." "Really? Are you sure?" Yeah, you're both being safe. Yes. You're not in trouble, are you? No, I promise. James sighed. All right. See you tomorrow, then. Okay. Cheers. Sirius snapped the compact shut and shoved it back into his pocket, turning back to Remus. There. Done. You didn't have to do that. If you were worried about leaving him here with me, I'm really just making sure he's okay. Sirius stiffened at the implication, but reminded himself that Mooney was probably exhausted and stressed, and really didn't mean for the comment to sting as much as it did. Still, his voice was cool as he said, And I'm making sure you're okay, Remus. I'm not leaving you to spend all night alone in this place. Come on, let's get comfortable. Plenty of floor to go around. He shot him a grin, shaking off his irritation and extending an arm. Remus's eyes looked a bit misty as he sat beside him, curling under his arm and resting his head against Sirius's shoulder. Sirius felt a surge of affection as he leaned down to kiss the top of his head, squeezing Mooney a bit more tightly. I'm sorry, Remus said, stifling a yawn. He's not... I don't want you to think he usually acts this way. He's obviously had a bad time. What happened to him? Sirius asked, looking over at the sleeping boy. What happened to make him end up here, like this? He got kicked out of St. Edmund's 2 years ago, Remus explained, closing his eyes. Didn't have anywhere else to go. Can't get a job because he didn't do his exams at school. And I'm guessing he hasn't got a proper address. Remus said it so matter-of-factly, as if it was something that happened all the time. And Sirius supposed it probably was. But he had never seen it before, never really thought about it. Remus's outburst from the previous Christmas suddenly made more sense. Poor Sirius Black, spoilt little rich boy. Remus? This wouldn't happen to you, would it? Because you've got us. Yeah, Remus mumbled, already half asleep. I've got you, Padfoot. Don't worry about me.